The Mandalorian Season 3 finale had a lot of elements I thought were really fun, but I also struggled a bit with some of the story and character elements, especially when taken in the context of the whole season. On the positive side, I think the major beats were done really well. The fight for Mandalore itself was cool, the fight with Gideon was cool, and it was good to see the Mandalorians united at the end. But although I enjoyed those while watching it, I couldn't help but feel like a lot of the how felt underwhelming or even actively disappointing. One example of this is the culmination of a background element which has been going on since the first episode of the series, Gideon's Force-sensitive clones. The work Gideon has been doing there is basically what sets the whole series off, with the search for Grogu lasting up until the rescue last season. But rather than pay off in an interesting way, it felt like this was swept under the rug, unlike Gideon's new armor, which factored pretty heavily into the confrontation. We don't know if Gideon succeeded in making Force-sensitive clones of himself, but it doesn't really matter, because Din destroyed them not just before they could have any impact on what's going on, but before Gideon even explained what they had been. It's possible Gideon isn't actually dead, and Gideon this season was himself a clone and they just couldn't figure out mustache cloning technology, but I feel like a third fake out in a row on Gideon would be a letdown in its own way. It really does seem like they're ready to move on to a new chapter with the rest of the Imperial Remnant, so I don't see any of that Force-sensitive cloning coming into the Mandalorian in the same way or factoring into Gideon's story, which is a disappointment. I don't actually have a problem with how quickly Din got out of captivity though. It's great that he got an opportunity to be proactive in his own defense, and even got some help from Grogu, who's coming into his own as well. But I'm going to have to go back to the end of the last episode and see how Grogu got away and got to Din. I love the R5 sequence, and I think this growth with respect to droids is probably the biggest change for Din we've seen this season. It's kind of disappointing, on the other hand, because we've now finished the season without ever really examining how he feels about anything else that's going on. To me, one of the biggest impacts of the Season 2 finale wasn't Luke coming in and messing up all the Dark Troopers, and I would have been disappointed if the Mythosaur had done that for them this season. Instead, what sticks with me the most about Season 2's ending is the emotional goodbye with Din and Grogu, and that kind of emotional impact is what I feel has been missing this season as a whole. I'll talk about it more with a season overview, but we took back Mandalore, and while there was definitely a sense of unity, there's also a lot that went into this which I felt like deserved a bit more reaction, or at least direct acknowledgement from people. The Darksaber was an important cultural artifact, for example, for all the Mandalorians, but it especially played a strong role in the Night Owls and why they were willing to follow Bo-Katan. Clearly they made the choice at some point, now that it's destroyed, that it's no longer what matters, but while we got Bo-Katan shrugging it off in the duel, seeing some sort of acknowledgement happen from the rest of the Night Owls that this is a painful loss, yet it's something they needed to move beyond, would have been nice, rather than that happening off-screen just by implication. It just builds into a perception for me that while the characters are going from point A to point B, doing thing C, they don't ever actually feel particularly strongly about anything, which makes it harder for me to feel strongly about it. Compare that again to Din and Grogu's emotional goodbye, or even the clear apprehension in Bo-Katan's face at the end of Season 2 over Din's new ownership of the Darksaber. I'm happy for the Mandalorians' victory retaking Mandalore because we know it's a thing they should want, but it feels like the show has rested too heavily on that retaking as a focal point, and passed up many opportunities for emotional growth or expression on the way, setting up all the ingredients for emotional investment for the characters, but then never quite taking that leap and paying it off. There was a bit at the end with the Mandalorians coming together in Axe's cry of "For Mandalore," standing next to his former somewhat rival Paz's son, which I do think has some nice possibilities for a new father-son relationship, helping to unite the clans more. But the deeper part of that feels like a background assumption, and my assumptions about what things mean or how they'll pay off, like Bo-Katan being apprehensive about being told to take off her helmet by a somewhat threatening armor, just really haven't paid off so far. So I don't know how much I can rely on that becoming true in Season 4 with any of these other assumptions. The Grogu and Din adoption scene was heartwarming, but we've had Din referred to as Grogu's father within the show, even directly by the armor since Season 1. So it rang somewhat hollow to me as being another step for them to take. The space battle and the dogfights this season have been absolutely beautiful, and that was continued in this episode. I just wish we'd gotten a bit more of it. We saw a few chunks of what went on, but we didn't really get a great idea of what was going on with the space battle in general. They were so afraid of the fighter force being sent out last episode, but we don't know how that was ever overcome. They landed all their troops on the ground, but those fighters were still there and must have been dealt with somehow. And that's where I figured a cameo would have come from, and I think it could have fit naturally. highlighting the theme of unity by bringing in an ally, and showing even more that the Mandalorians have an ability to make friends and work together now. Instead, we just kind of missed out on that battle's conclusion. I'm not someone that thinks there always needs to be a cameo, but I think it would have fit in well there. All in all, while I don't love how the finale wrapped up some of the major themes, I did find it enjoyable for its own sake, and I think it's set up for a situation where it's much easier to address those complaints in Season 4. It almost seems like the act of retaking Mandalore did supersede a lot of the other problems within how the Mandalorians could relate to each other from an in-universe perspective, which is what Bo-Katan was so concerned about before, but it also took up a lot of the mental space for the writers compared to the more personal stories, so I'm excited to get back to some smaller adventures for Din and Grogu. I think we may still see some payoff of Bo-Katan's fears in the next season as well, with the occasional scene or episode about rebuilding Mandalore and bringing all the tribes together, but I don't expect a particularly deep examination of anything that I was hoping to see a bit more of this season, unfortunately. I'll have another full season review when I talk about everything in a bit broader context, but that's going to do it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.